Good afternoon. My name is Anthea Hancox and I'm the CEO of the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to the second and final follow-up session in our 2020 Mapping Social Cohesion Report event series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. In my case, here in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be present here today. And if you do happen to be joining us from somewhere else in Australia, please feel free to include the name of those nations in the chat function below. In today's session, we'll be taking a closer look at the trends in Australian attitudes on issues relating to government and politics. Using data from both the latest and past versions of the Mapping Social Cohesion Research Report, we'll unpack the complex overlapping attitudes between segments of the population and the percentage of Australians with strongly held negative views. We'll also shed some light on leadership in the face of the pandemic, how Australians responded to it, and where attitudes might be heading. And to help us cover all that ground, I'm pleased to introduce you to our two very special guest speakers for today's session. Emeritus Professor Andrew Markus of Monash University is the author of the 2020 Mapping Social Cohesion Report and previous reports in this series, meaning he has been tracking Australian attitudes relating to government and politics for more than a decade. His research specialisation spans the fields of social cohesion as it relates to minority and recently arrived communities, immigration policy, as well as the experiences of the Jewish diaspora in Australia. And for his work, he was recently awarded an Order of Australia. Delivering our joint keynote presentation today is special guest Karen Middleton. Karen is the Chief Political Correspondent for Schwartz Media's The Saturday paper and has covered national and international affairs as a political journalist for more than 30 years. The author of 2 books, Karen is also a regular contributor to ABC Radio, ABC TV's Insiders, and the 10 Network's The Project. Andrew and Karen, thank you both for being here today to share your knowledge and expertise. Now, just a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover before we begin today's session. This event is being recorded and will be available via the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute YouTube channel in the coming days, in case you want to refer back to it or share the link with your colleagues. Also, we will be using Mentimeter, as you can see there, an interactive event tool as a way for you to send in questions for our live Q&A segment later in the program. For those of you who haven't used Mentimeter before, it's very simple. All you need to do is follow one of the prompts on screen now. Either head to mentimeter.com on your desktop or smartphone browser and enter the code at the top of the screen, or simply scan the QR code on your smartphone to submit a question for Andrew or Karen anytime throughout the session. Finally, for those of you wanting to take this conversation online via social media, I encourage you to use the hashtag Social Cohesion Report. Now, I think we're ready to get today's discussion underway. So I'll now hand you over to Andrew, who'll set the context for today's webinar. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Anthea. And good afternoon, everybody. If you are in the Eastern time zone, otherwise still morning over in the West, as I understand. All right, so I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners. Like Anthea, I'm speaking on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The opportunity presents itself today for us to look at, in a more relaxed and deeper way, on the findings of the Scanlon Foundation surveys that were conducted in 2020, focused particularly on government and politics. And in addition to that, we now have the opportunity, being in early May, to reflect a bit more about what happened in 2020 and what happened subsequently. All right, so if I just take you through then the presentation. The aspects that I'm wanting to cover, first of all, how did Australian democracy cope at a time of crisis? What are the learnings that we can take away from the experience of 2020? And then a major focus for my presentation today is to consider attitudes by political alignment, by which I mean major parties, in particular Labor, Liberal, Greens, and also by contrast, One Nation. I want to look at shifting priorities. So how did priorities shift in the first half of 2020 and then in the second half? One, I think, particularly interesting aspect is to go beyond the general categories of the political parties and to consider divisions within the groupings, the balance of opinion within the groupings. So I'll be spending just a little bit of time looking at the cluster analysis that was undertaken of our survey findings. And then the last section deals with opinion over the last couple of months, how opinion is shifting over the last couple of months. All right, so first of all, with regard to democracy, like a major feature of the report, our findings, was somewhat surprising increased level of trust in government. The widely held view that effective leadership was provided, including the level of support for those who were severely impacted in their employment and businesses who were impacted. And this is the broad indicators. Our general findings are that with many questions, you don't get a lot of change from one year to the next. So the fact that people's trust in the federal government to do the right thing for the Australian people went from 36 to 54, an increase nearly of 20 percentage points, and basically held at that level in the second half of the year. You know, I emphasize this when I talk about the Scanlon Foundation surveys, but the fact that we have a time series so that we can actually understand what 54% mean. Because without the conflict, we might think, oh, well, 54%, it's just slightly more than half. What's so extraordinary about that? Well, what is extraordinary about that is that over the previous 6, 7, 8 years, the average for that sort of question was around 33, 34%, thinking that the federal government was doing the right thing for the Australian people almost always or most of the time. And then that very sudden jump, which we can see from the time series. Other indicators were also moving in the same direction. So the system of government we have in Australia works fine or only needs minor change, as distinct from those who think that it needs major change or should be totally replaced. That went from 62 to 69, and again held at that level, marginally higher in November. And the assessment of the federal government response was extraordinarily 85%, very well or well. So I want now to look at a little bit more detail at these findings. See, this gives us the long-term perspective. The first time for that sort of question that a majority gave a tick was in July 2020. Previously, the highest level had been in 2009, in the period of the Rudd Labor government, when that was at the peak of its popularity, when it was 48%, and then collapsed quite dramatically in 2010 and basically didn't recover until 2020. And this is an indication of the long-term trend with this, people who consider that the system's working or only needs minor change. And it went from 46% of that view in 2019, 46 plus 16, so 62%. And that quite substantial in majority, 69% and 72% in 2020. It's also very interesting to look at the balance of responses. So if there's a 5-point response scale, and at one end we have very well or very badly at the other, but the two positives, very well and fairly well, you can see from that pie chart that the majority, when they're asked about the federal government in July, are still somewhat reserved. Very well, 28%, fairly well, 57%. So that's the relative balance. Almost 2 to 1, fairly well, as opposed to very well. When we look at the state government and the views of the state governments, some of the state governments were somewhat different. In that, in Western Australia, 83% considered that the government was doing very well, compared to 16% fairly well. And that was the strongest endorsement of a government in that 2020 period. And it's interesting then to with hindsight, look at the West Australian election, which saw almost a unanimous vote for the Labor government, very few seats won by the opposition. And that's reflected in our findings in July, one could say. In South Australia, again, the ratio was 2 to 1, very well, as opposed to fairly well. And this is what I mean about having the opportunity today to look at this data with a little bit more care and not being, in a way, having to cover the richness of the Scanlon Foundation surveys, but to have the opportunity to look more closely at what this data might be telling us. Queensland, the ratio is almost even, very well or fairly well. And then when we look at Victoria and New South Wales, a somewhat different result, with the lowest rating in Victoria. And at the time of the survey, Victoria had just entered the second lockdown, which was not experienced across Australia. Now, having disaggregated very well and fairly well, we don't lose sight of the extraordinary result that in 3 of the 5 states, more than 90% gave that very positive rating to their state governments. New South Wales, 81%. I mean, normally what we could say is that if a government gets 52% endorsement, it's doing well. And that again gives us a perspective on the extraordinary nature of these figures. And then if we compare July and November, because many of you will know that the Scanlon Foundation, contrary to practice, because annually, normally we do one survey in July, but given the extraordinary year and the findings in July, it was thought worthwhile and important to then look at November and see what had changed or what hadn't changed. And what we can see is that the numbers in November are even more positive than they were in July, except in Queensland. And in Queensland, it's still 85% positive. The experience of Victoria is interesting, because Victoria had the most difficult experience of the pandemic. A significant number of people died, a lockdown that went on much longer than any other parts of Australia, a much more severe lockdown. And yet at the end of that period, again, a very strong endorsement of the actions of the state government. I think for me anyway, these findings are important because often if we look at the media, what the media is reporting is not the solid overall perspective of the Australian population, which these findings indicate. But I think often the people who are making noise, the people who are critical of government. For example, we've got criticisms at the moment with regard to right of entry of citizens. To what extent do those views, critical of government responses, reflect mainstream opinion as indicated by these surveys? And I think you can make your own judgment on that. This is a specific question about the lockdown restrictions rather than the response of the government. And again, when we look at the findings closely, we can see that on that Likert scale, where you've got 4 or 5 response options, how heavily skewed the response options are towards definitely required. Not 50-50, but like in Western Australia, 86-13, even in Victoria, 77-16. And that was when Victoria was entering that second lockdown. And a large degree of unity across the states. The people who think that these lockdowns are not required or definitely not required, very few, under 10%. And this is the Victorian responses in November, where Victorians had experienced that very severe lockdown that went on for months. And again, the relative proportions, definitely required, probably required, very heavily skewed towards the definitely required. And 87% of respondents endorsing government action. You know, I think that there's a lot to reflect on the experience of 2020. And obviously we'll have opportunity to discuss this with you later on in this session. And this is an indication, you know, of how Australians are rating their government response relative to other countries, citizens in other countries. And this is very high quality research conducted by the Pew Research Centre in the United States, with a survey administered in a number of different countries. And you can say Australia, you can see Australia's up near the very top. United States and the United Kingdom barely, not even succeeding in getting a majority, 50% positive endorsement of their governments. I think this is also an interesting finding. We have a survey question that asks people to indicate if they, you know, we'd be better off with a strong leader who doesn't have to be bothered with Parliament. This is again another way of looking at the workings of democracy and whether people think that the democratic system is the best system. And those, we have a general question: would you say that having a strong leader who does not have to bother with Parliament would be very good or fairly good? And that indicator in the general question didn't really move. You can see it's 22% in 2019, 21 and 21 in 2020. But when the question was in actually a different part of the survey and was worded during the COVID-19 pandemic, would having a strong leader who does not have to bother with Parliament, would it be good or not good? A much higher proportion of the population willing to accept that perhaps that is the way to go in a period of crisis. It's not a majority viewpoint, but it got up to 38%, which is a high number. And I think it underscores what a significant element of the population is looking for at a time such as that. And I would say that what people are looking for is unity and effective government action that deals with problems more so than democracy as we know it, which is a battle between various participants, point scoring. I think this sort of finding indicates what people are looking for, and obviously they're looking for effective government action that produces results. Now, if we look at these views by political alignment, I think there's no great surprises here, but it's interesting to look at the patterns of response. So this question about trust of government, and you call the overall figure was 52%, but the way that this breaks down is Liberal National 75%, indicating you can trust the government. And in a way, what this question taps into is the people who are supporters of the party in power will be more strongly endorsing actions of government than those who support parties that are not in power. Although I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that even amongst Greens, One Nation, Labor, the way that the trend of those numbers, comparing 2018-19 with 2020, in the case of Labor, it's a doubling in that endorsement, even though Labor's not in power. Greens are more reserved, 21 to 31. One Nation, it's a small sample, so it may be skewed, but with the results we got, it was 9 to 31%. And I think there's a very clear pattern there. This question, the Australian system of government works fine. And this is July, and you remember 69% overall thought that the system worked fine or needs only minor change. And we have a Labor almost at the average of the national, a stronger Liberal coalition at 84%, and Greens and One Nation similarly around 50%. I mean, it's interesting that with some sorts of questions, Greens and One Nation supporters in similar proportions indicate agreement or disagreement. But of course, not on all questions, as we'll see. This is the endorsement of the federal government's response to the pandemic. And again, strongest Labor and Liberal National, but Greens and One Nation also, in July, close to 80%, drops down in November, but not a huge drop. So even amongst One Nation supporters, 2/3 are positive with regard to the actions of the federal government. Okay, now with regard to, do you think that the lockdowns imposed were required? Sorry, I'm just having a little trouble with my screen. All right, back. And we look across the spectrum, 80% or above for three of the major parties, like Liberals 78, Greens 83, Labor 86, more reserve in the case of One Nation. But again, when we break down these numbers by political alignment, what we're still seeing is heavily skewed towards strongest response, definitely required. The attractions of a strong leader, interesting to reflect here how that breaks down by political alignment. So now you can see that the Greens and One Nation are at opposite ends of the spectrum with regard to this question. Amongst One Nation, 50%. Remember, the national average for this question was around 38%. And so Labor and Liberal close to the National, Greens below, One Nation above. And then when we break down questions to do with national identification, you can see a very clear pattern there that the strongest level of identification, say with the Australian way of life and culture, and the importance of maintaining that, One Nation 73 strongly agree, Liberal Nationals 61, Labor 40, and Greens 18. When we aggregate strongly agree and agree, say in the case of Greens, which is the lowest proportion, we're still getting like 67%. So it's a very strong endorsement of the Australian way of life. Not many people question what that might mean because they answer the question. If they can't understand the question, it doesn't make any sense to them, you get a high proportion, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. And we're not getting that high proportion. So that's that pattern with regard to national identification. With regard to attitudes to immigrants not adopting Australian values, the strongest level of agreement that immigrants are not adopting Australian values, we find amongst One Nation and then Liberal, and there's quite a contrast with regard to Greens. And we're getting this consistent pattern of differentiation, One Nation, Liberal, Labor, and Greens. Immigrants from many different countries make Australia stronger. You see the level of disagreement in One Nation is 69, Liberal 35, Labor 20, and Greens less than 10%. So there's a lot of richness in this data, and it enables us to understand, and I don't think it's huge surprises here, but to understand how by political alignment, intended vote, how attitudes are distributed. Negative attitude to specific groups, and a different graphic representation, but again, you can see the consistency of the data. For example, negative attitudes towards immigrants from Sudan, Greens 21% negative, then 38, 61, 83. And again, quite a consistent pattern. So one of the things you could take away from this is that the majority of the people who identify with a political party by saying, I intend to vote for that political party, have a set of attitudes which is consistent, but it's not like 100% consistent, which I'll show you in a second. First of all, with regard to priorities. Normally when we ask this question, what do you think is the most important problem facing Australia today? What we find is that the strongest problem that people see, it's to do with the economy, and that's the blue line. And what happened in 2020 is that collapsed. And as you'd expect, COVID came to dominate as the most important issue, selected by 63%. But by November, we're starting to get a return to the pattern of previous years. COVID and concern with it has dropped down, the economy has gone up, and so has the third point, which is to do with environment. Environment dropped to 5% in July, but seen as the most important issue by 13% in November. And I would think that that's what would continue in the coming years. All right, so then just two other points I want to look at: disunity amongst party supporters. And the last thing is the trend of opinion in 2021. So when we do a cluster analysis, and what the cluster analysis does, it groups people by, they've got similar views on a range of issues, and they're more similar, most similar. The largest proportion, a group like comfortable optimists, 27%. But then we have a number of other groups, 15 to 21% of the population, conformist, reformers, xenophobes, financial strugglers, or anti-establishment. Those who are strongly anti-establishment, very negative about government, it's about just 5%. So then if we compare Liberal, National and Labor, and what are the things that are really striking in that sort of comparison? Well, it's that very high level of comfortable optimists. Almost 4 out of 10 of those who identify as Liberal or National, compared to 22% Labor. And then we look at reformers, a small segment of the Liberal National identify as reformers, 27% Labor. So that's, and you may be interested to look again at the report and look at this analysis by Dr. Emmanuel Guzman, who undertook this analysis for us. If we look then and compare Greens and One Nation, what do we find? And here the very striking finding is the proportion of Greens who identify as reformers, nearly 1 out of 2, compared to 7% of One Nation. Whereas the group who are xenophobic, you know, who are not enamored of multiculturalism and diverse immigration intake, it's interesting that it's not 0% in the Greens. And I think the point that emerges here, and when we look at attitudes as we did before on a range of issues by political alignment, we have to bear in mind that that's a majority viewpoint within these political groupings, but it's not unanimous. So that we even find a proportion very reserved about multiculturalism and diversity within the Greens, but they're only 8%. Whereas in One Nation, they're quite a significant segment, almost 1/4. For us, that's another perspective. And the last point, of course, is anti-establishment, which on average is 5% of the Australian population, but is well over twice that proportion amongst the One Nation supporters. All right, now then the last part, and very quickly. This is data obtained from the website Poll Bludger, maintained by William Bowe. And he aggregates a number of different survey findings. And the dots represent different surveys and what they obtained on comparing the support for Prime Minister Morrison and leader of the Labor Party, Anthony Albanese. And the points that I think to really highlight here is that you can see that early in 2020, the blue line was well below the level of support for the leader of the opposition. What happened then in the context of the pandemic, how satisfaction with the Prime Minister went from -20 up to +40. And currently, you know, it's on a downward spiral. It's now around 15%. So what interesting question to ask, does this represent then, you know, a period of crisis? You look to government, you look for strong leadership. It was provided and it was endorsed, but now we're reverting to politics as we normally experience it. Interestingly, when we try to track what it is that's driving that disapproval, and this is now the findings of the Essential Research, which is a research publication that comes out every 2 weeks and is based on a non-probability but very large panel of respondents. And I think the interesting point here is that, well, if we look at the general approval rating, it's gone from 66 to 54 on this poll. Men have hardly moved at all. So that it seems that what is driving that decline in support, decline in approval of the Prime Minister, it's women, not men. Normally you don't get a major divergence by gender when we disaggregate survey findings. But here we're now in a situation where in April 21, the proportion who approved the job that Scott Morrison is doing, 65% men, 46% women. And yet it was level pegging in February of this year. And this is the last slide that I'll show you. It's the two-party preferred, so that prior to the pandemic, Labor was ahead. During the pandemic, the Liberal National Party was in the ascendant. And you can see with those dots that there were some survey findings that had the difference close to like 54%, 46%. More common, 53, 47, 52, 48. But now Labor, according to the sort of aggregation of polls, is forging ahead, and the Liberal Party falling behind. And we may want to discuss why that happened. But the contrast then, I think, and this is my final comment, of what happened in 2020, in an extraordinary year in the experience of Australians, and now what's happening as we get into nearly halfway through 2021. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for sharing that summary. It's particularly interesting to consider whether the trust in government can be maintained or built in 2021 and beyond, or will recent events have an impact on this? And clearly, women from your slides are having a significant impact on this, but we'll come back, as you said, to some of these questions during the Q&A. Karen, already there are questions coming through for you on the influence of current events in Parliament on public opinion and with climate change. So there are many who are very keen to hear your thoughts. So as someone who has followed issues impacting on social cohesion closely for many years, I'm particularly keen to hear your own observations in relation to community attitudes to each other and to the different levels of government, and how these attitudes might be tracking now. In light of the COVID year and subsequently, and perhaps more generally, your thoughts on the role of public narratives and leadership would be very much appreciated. So I would love for you to share your insights with us now. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthea. I hope I can live up to all those expectations. Cross our fingers. Maybe I'll answer some of those questions in the course of this presentation. We'll see. I would like to first of all acknowledge also the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to all of their elders. Thank you too, of course, to the Scanlon Foundation for inviting me to participate in this session today and to offer some thoughts on government during the pandemic, Australians' response to the decision-making, and on leadership in general. And I'd like to thank Professor Markus for his very interesting dissection of all of those annual Scanlon survey findings. I thought I'd build on his remarks with a few observations on trust, character, communication, leadership, and accountability, particularly in the context of COVID-19 and national politics. On the face of it, the demonstrated increase in public trust in government over the past year might seem counterintuitive. But when we look at our recent history in another global crisis, maybe it becomes a little bit less surprising. And here I refer to Professor Markus's historical graph on trust that showed it being high, its previous high point being in the time of Kevin Rudd. In considering the Scanlon findings, I've been reflecting on a conversation I had with Vox Populi social researcher Rebecca Huntley just over a year ago about research she conducted in the context of the global financial crisis back in 2008. Last April, Huntley talked me through the findings of research initially undertaken in the period after Kevin Rudd was swept into office in 2007. Rudd had begun his prime ministership hugely popular, but his popularity began to wane within a year of his taking office, and criticisms were emerging, suggestions that he was too unfocused and too frantic. Then the financial crisis took hold, and those criticisms evaporated. Australians wanted the nation to pull together, to get behind the Prime Minister and the government and deal with the unfolding drama constructively and collaboratively without party political infighting. They placed their trust firmly in him and the government to protect them. Fast forward to last year with the COVID-19 pandemic descending, and something similar seems to have emerged. Research was showing that people wanted their leaders to jettison partisanship and just get on with making them safe. The Labor opposition's polling also clearly identified the demand for unity. It was forced to fall in behind the government because the public didn't want to see brawling when their health and livelihoods were at stake. In Professor Markus's data, we saw some hesitating about the federal government, that issue around handling things fairly well versus very well. But overall, the verdict was positive. Going back to Rebecca Huntley's research from 2008-9, where it got really interesting, was in what happened when the global financial crisis began to subside. Moving through 2009, once the emergency dissipated and people began to feel more secure, Huntley found that the criticisms returned. Interestingly, Kevin Rudd and his government got no particular credit for having protected Australia from the worst of the impact of the global financial crisis and the kind of economic devastation that had befallen other countries. Instead, people seemed to take the general view that the government had merely done the job that was expected of it. When Rebecca Huntley recounted this to me just over a year ago, we discussed the potential parallels with the twin health and economic crises of the COVID-19 pandemic and wondered whether the same would occur for Scott Morrison. Reflecting on the arc of national politics over the last 18 months, I'd suggest some more similarities pardon me, have emerged with the 2008 and 2009 scenario. As we know, Prime Minister Scott Morrison won a surprise election victory in 2019 and his popularity surged. But summer 2019-20 saw Morrison's popularity plummet after he ducked off to Hawaii for a secret holiday during the bushfire crisis. Then when he was challenged on radio about that decision, he responded, "I don't hold a hose, mate." It didn't go down well. Morrison was seen to be abandoning his country at a time when leadership was required, and then compounding that by suggesting he personally didn't have a role. The coalition took a hit in the opinion polls as a result. Figures published by Newspoll show a trajectory in the two-party vote that closely tracks those events, and I'd like to take a look at those. By the middle of November 2019, the party vote after the distribution of preferences in the Newspoll showed the coalition and Labor on 50-50, literally neck and neck. In the months between mid-November and mid-December 2019, as the fires spread and worsened and support to fight them mobilised, the coalition's vote rose and Labor's fell, leaving the government 4 points ahead. But between December and January, when Morrison's twin Hawaii and hose-holding stumbles occurred, the coalition's vote plunged 3 percentage points in less than a month, falling further again in February 2020. His rating as better Prime Minister also dived, and Labor leader Anthony Albanese pulled ahead as controversy raged around the Prime Minister's handling of the bushfire crisis. Those mistakes were extremely damaging for Morrison because, or potentially so, because they went to questions of character, of judgment, and of whose interests he really had most at heart. We all know it is much easier to maintain a good reputation than to repair one that's been dented, and he had a lot of work to do with the electorate. Then came the pandemic, which helped do some of that work in very quick time. He had learned from his mistakes, and he made a key role for himself with the formation of the National Cabinet. Although the Commonwealth has responsibility for quarantine, he delegated it to the states because the system they all adopted involved hotels and because the states and territories run the health and policing systems. Politically, quarantine also happened to be where the greatest risk lay of things going bad, and that also handily allowed the federal government to distance itself from the problems that emerged. Morrison found a hose to hold. He became National Communicator-in-Chief. As COVID-19 worsened and the Prime Minister took centre stage, leading news conferences announcing measures to try to contain the growing crisis, his rating as better Prime Minister began to climb. So did that of his coalition. When Victoria's devastating second wave brought on a 4-month lockdown, Morrison and his colleagues ditched their all in this together approach and began criticising Victorian Labor Premier Daniel Andrews. Throughout 2020, Morrison pulled dramatically ahead of Labor leader Anthony Albanese as better Prime Minister, and has stayed there ever since. Ahead, that is, he has suffered a diminishing in his vote, as we just heard. The coalition also remained significantly ahead of Labor throughout last year. Its support seesawing between July, when its vote peaked, and October. In late October, as Victoria's second COVID wave subsided and the associated 4-month lockdown ended, the nation began to exhale. As things started to normalise nationwide, the coalition's rating began to fall. It seemed that Rebecca Huntley's previous findings could be coming to pass again, although reflecting slightly different circumstances. As the emergency phase of the pandemic eased, criticisms of Scott Morrison and his government resurfaced. Unlike the global financial crisis, the pandemic was multidimensional, and keeping the virus at bay through border measures was only the first part of the task. There was still the need to more permanently protect the community through vaccination, and the related need to help the economy back on its feet. As they did for Kevin Rudd, questions of the leader's character, judgment, and priorities re-emerged during the first part of this year, reigniting the memory of the Prime Minister's mistakes during the so-called Black Summer. People began to question the plans to axe the JobKeeper subsidy, prompting a slight extension of it into the new year. The government talked up its planned vaccine rollout, but a slow start seeded doubts as its bold promises about seemingly unmeetable deadlines were adjusted and then ultimately abandoned. The coalition's fall in the polls only worsened when allegations of sexual assault in Parliament House and attitudes and questions about attitudes to women more generally began to dominate news coverage. It wasn't until Scott Morrison was able to change the subject through April in the lead up to Anzac Day that the coalition's polling started to improve again. And here I'd like to look more closely at the issue of leadership. There's an interesting difference between what's happening to the party vote in 2021 and what's showing in polls on the leaders, on which Morrison will no doubt seek to capitalise. Although Labor has improved its two-party vote, in the better Prime Minister stakes, Albanese's relative irrelevance in relation to managing the pandemic, and therefore the sense that he hasn't been very visible, sees Morrison maintaining a huge personal lead. It's more common than not for Prime Ministers to be ahead on the better Prime Minister measure, and Albanese has largely held his ground, if crept up slightly this year. But he is still streets behind the incumbent. And that's not only because of invisibility. Labor has detected the public attitude shifting from the demand for unity to the expectation that the opposition now hold the government to account, and it's tried to move accordingly, but it has been struggling to execute that effectively. This is a reminder that communication is up there with character as a core leadership requirement. Albanese has not been doing terribly well on that front, still facing criticism from the progressively inclined for not cutting through. Fear of making a mistake in those leadership positions can obscure a person's natural ways of communicating and make them seem wooden or hesitant or both. We've seen that on both sides of politics in the past. That can quickly seed disappointment among those who might have hoped for more or better, especially if it's paired with a sense of policy hesitation. Look at how that disappointment took hold quite quickly in relation to Malcolm Turnbull. For Albanese's leadership going forward, the difference in the better Prime Minister and party figures mean, theoretically at least, that Labor's improved party rating could actually be as much a danger to Albanese himself as it is a psychological boost for the ALP. If his personal ratings languished and his colleagues decided a different leader could actually tip them over into victory, he could be in danger. At the moment, I think that's unlikely. What is likely to hold Albanese in place is the absence of an obvious successor with enough support within the party to oust him, given all of the toxic fallout that we know comes from ousting a leader. We've seen that movie before a number of times. If both sides have learnt nothing else from the past decade of turmoil at the top of their teams, they've at least learnt this: the benefits of changing leaders must clearly outweigh the potential risks from the damage it would necessarily cause to go down that path. There's no indication that many in Labor have reached that conclusion. Beyond communication, there's still the question of character. The Hawaii hose episode demonstrates that our leaders' character matters a lot to Australian voters. It goes beyond trust in government generally to trust in an individual. Voters scrutinise closely the character, judgment and priorities of the person in charge and the team around them. If concerns about character connect with concerns about the twin other factors, priorities and policy, and generate doubts about whether the leader's actions reflect the wider community's best interests, they will be marked down. This is a potential risk for Scott Morrison. He's still battling problems with the vaccine rollout, for which the government has chosen to take for which the federal government has chosen to take most responsibility, and now has to fix the problems created by poor communication. Many people are scared now of having the jab. That's a big challenge with a lot riding on it. Beyond that, Scott Morrison has successfully changed the subject from the difficult women thing to issues on which the government has better credentials, including economic management and defence and security. Call me cynical, but I'm not sure it's entirely a coincidence that we're suddenly hearing so much talk about veterans and defence. The Prime Minister is in far north Queensland today, for example, in the Townsville-based seat of Herbert, home to many defence personnel. It's one of a number of seats where the defence vote will have considerable importance. We've also heard an increase in assertive language lately from within the government about potential military conflict with China. The coalition generally rates ahead of Labor on security issues. I suggest we're starting to see the shape of the coming election campaign, whenever it is. Next week's budget, with its much better than expected bottom line, thanks largely to a booming iron ore price, will reveal a bit more. It's likely to be aimed at neutralising some of the government's political problems. For example, it'll feature heavily measures targeting women, including more help with childcare. As Professor Markus's slides showed, between February and April this year, Scott Morrison's approval dropped 9 percentage points, according to the Essential poll, and that was essentially entirely among women, almost entirely among women. Support among men, as he mentioned a little while ago, stayed largely the same. So Scott Morrison needs to fix that women problem, and fast. All of this is designed to add up to the message that the coalition makes us safe, secure and prosperous. All of the steps the government is taking. More, and that message is that it does that more than Labor does. Pandemic aside, I think Australians have some basic expectations of their political leaders. They prefer them to believe in something. That goes to genuineness and conviction. Whatever that thing is they believe in, they expect them to be upfront about it and not try to hide it. And they expect them to demonstrate that, regardless of their own beliefs, they place the good of the broad Australian community as their highest priority. They expect leaders to be, people expect leaders to be accountable, to be both willing and able to explain what they're doing and why. Bottom line, voters detest tricky. But although populism makes long-term governing harder, it can certainly work in the short term. And that's where a national crisis can help paper over, in some respects, any of those elements on which a leader might be otherwise marked down, provided the crisis is managed well. So I'd like to finish today by looking briefly at the accountability issue and the India travel ban of last week, and where they both fit in all this. The government's decision to ban flights coming from India and to apply criminal penalties to Australians trying to return to their own country has proven highly controversial. In that context, I refer back to Professor Markus's analysis about Australians' level of willingness or unwillingness to accept a strong leader who does not have to bother with Parliament. The Scanlon survey reveals that during the pandemic, people are more prepared, as he said, to tolerate such a strong leader, acting without having to consult Parliament first. Perhaps detecting this sentiment and and capitalising on the blanket that COVID-19 has thrown over government activities with the declaration of the biosecurity emergency, the coalition government has used the pandemic to do all manner of things, some related directly to the COVID-19 pandemic and some a little bit less so, some temporary and some permanent, or likely permanent. These moves include cutting back mail deliveries and commissioning a review which found that the government should sell off the most lucrative part of the Australia Post business, the parcel business, making it likely impossible for local post offices to restore many of those cut services. They also include handing out billions of dollars in grants to all kinds of organisations without parliamentary scrutiny in both cases. And the India ban is another such move undertaken without Parliament's approval and with no capacity for Parliament to review it, one that many lawyers are arguing is unconstitutional. It's unpopular with those concerned about the legal underpinnings of our democracy, those who believe it discriminates against one section of the community, those who fear it will fuel racist sentiment, and those who are stuck in India or have family or friends who can't get home. But it seems to be pretty popular with the wider community. Early polls suggest the majority consider it to be putting the national interest first. So the political question for the government then becomes how upset it makes the Indian Australian community who carry sway in a few marginal seats. The government is now working on placating them. The decision to reach for the first ever blanket ban on Australian citizens returning to their own country under threat of criminal prosecution demonstrates vividly how far we've shifted in terms of the way the government is prepared to exercise its authority arbitrarily, particularly under the cover of COVID. It does solve a genuine problem, the risk of infection coming to Australia, given the horrific situation in India. But it's also potentially politically useful, possibly in the areas where the government most needs support. And we saw some of those party breakdowns show us interesting emphasis in that regard. And I think also the immigration figures that we heard, or the attitudes to immigration, might be relevant here as well. As Professor Markus showed us, those who are more willing to accept a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Parliament number more in the COVID context than outside it, but they're still not a national majority. Nevertheless, Morrison and his colleagues are very conscious that COVID-related strength has played very well for his counterparts around the states. The Scanlon findings on the states have been reflected at the ballot box, and that will be encouraging to the federal government. In Queensland, Western Australia, the Northern Territory, the Australian Capital Territory, and most recently this past weekend in Tasmania, incumbents who are seen to have taken a tough stance and done a good job in the pandemic were returned to office. Scott Morrison is hoping very much to join them. So I will leave you finally with this thought. Calling a federal election while the pandemic is still a thing, provided the vaccination rollout gets properly on track, and after taking one or two high-profile, tough, controversial, but seemingly popular decisions at the federal level, picking up the hose once again, you might say, well, that might be a very tempting thing for a Prime Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I know that you've already started to generate quite a bit of interest amongst the audience. So I have a number of questions already, so I'm going to go straight to there. But first of all, just a little reminder to the audience that you can begin submitting questions via Mentimeter, which is, as you can see on the screen, either go to menti.com on your desktop or mobile browser and enter the 8-digit code, or you can simply scan the QR code. But clearly quite a number of people have already figured out how to do that. So once you've also joined the session and you can see the questions there, don't hesitate to like any if you want to move them up the process by which I can actually identify the ones that we'll be asking. So we'll aim to get through as many questions as we can in the next 30 minutes or so. So I might just start with the first, with a question that's just recently come in to both you, Andrew, and, which is not the question that's on the screen, but to Andrew and Karen. Aside from communication and character, what else makes a good political leader?
Well, I think I've just given you my list. Andrew, have you got views?
Andrew, what do you think makes a good political leader?
I think, Karen, I can't go past your list, you know, that you have to stand for something, you have to believe it, and it should be something that is sort of palatable, acceptable. And I think to be able to deliver. To me, that's like a key lesson of 2020.
Yep.
Yes.
People want their issues addressed. And I think it was within a narrow time frame, narrow frame of issues, keeping the population safe. But going forward, I think that's the issue. Like, I think you highlighted the economy. If the, you know, the current situation, recovery is underscored by the price of iron ore, but does that actually, can that translate into jobs for people, economic circumstances? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it'll also be parlayed into this question of security, because the coalition has been good in the past at framing issues of trust, for example, not as, and I'll go back to, you know, some people might remember the whole children overboard issue with asylum seekers and how there was a question about whether people in government had lied or not. And then John Howard's next campaign slogan came out as, who do you trust? And everybody was a bit shocked that he did that, but he reframed that as being, who do you trust to keep the economy safe and stable, for you to keep your jobs? And so the coalition's been very good at parlaying these issues into one, or into an idea of stability. And I think that the economic management question and the security question will come together for the coalition to try to form a picture of a stable and secure government, keeping people safe and keeping them in jobs and that kind of thing. And back to the question of what makes a good political leader, if I was going to add one more thing off the top of my head, I'd probably add consistency, because I think if you're too inconsistent as a leader, it confuses people and they start to doubt those other things. They start to doubt what you are really standing for. I think Scott Morrison has made that mistake on occasion where he's changed his mind, and that is because there is a lot of emphasis on populism, I think, and on you know, if sort of running something up the flagpole, and if it proves to cause too much unrest, or unrest that can't be addressed another way, you know, pulling it down again. And so the government has perhaps lacks a little consistency in some of its decision making, and that's a potential risk.
Thank you, Karen. Just going back to the previous question that was there, because it has come up in both your presentations, do you think any shifts in trust or opinion from female voters as a result of recent events will impact trust from this audience on government policies that are not related to gender issues and policies?
Well, I think anything that damages trust in a leader or in a government is not good, I would think. But again, as I say, what the government will try to do is to shift the idea of what it means to trust government to focus on areas where the trust is stronger. So, and it will try to neutralize with policy announcements and with money and other issues, any problem that it has with women. So I think we're going to see a lot of focus on women in the budget coming up. We've already heard about this childcare announcement. I'm sure there'll be a lot more, so that the government will, if it can't directly address the trust issue among women, it will at least give women another reason to go, well, I'm not sure how much I trust them, but they are going to do these good things, so perhaps I'll vote for them anyway. But you know, if there's a core doubt in government, you know, a solid core doubt about what they really stand for, and that's, you know, that's potentially damaging, and that could spread more widely than just one narrow issue about, say, attitudes to women.
Well, certainly, you know, women have opinions on everything, as everybody does. So how they feel about government in general will probably have an impact on issues outside of just gender-related policies.
But they may vote on more than just the government's attitude to women too. You know, that's not the only thing that affects people and makes them decide who they're going to support.
Yeah,
I think, you know, a big issue is the environment, climate change, and if it's the situation that we return more to a stable situation in terms of controlling the pandemic without major outbreaks, and the vaccination program, you know, gathers momentum, I think the environment issue will emerge. And in terms of politics, that's an issue that, I don't know, Karen, what you think, but I think that Labor and Greens have potential to bring forth policies of broader appeal than the division that you have within the national Liberal groupings.
Yeah, I think both major parties, or the coalition on one side and Labor on the other, have got potential political complications with policies on climate change, particularly in terms of targets and how to achieve targets. At the moment, the government is saying we don't want to set a target. We expect that it will probably, in terms of emissions reduction, we expect it will probably end up endorsing the net zero by 2050 target, but we may find that we've been a bit left behind, that the rest of the world has already done that and moved on to set goals that are closer in. But Labor is still trying to manage a mixed constituency as well, with the coal mining belt and the people that Joel Fitzgibbon is purporting to represent. So it's not entirely without complication, I think, on the left or the progressive side of politics, in particular with Labor. The other interesting thing is whether people feel if the government, and we are hearing a shift in the rhetoric now to embrace the reality of climate change and the need for action from the coalition side, that, you know, in the recent decade, we haven't heard. So it has shifted. The question is it a shift of genuine belief, or is it a shift of necessity because suddenly we've had a change of president in the United States, and the emphasis, the balance in the world of attitude has shifted, and we may now find ourselves facing penalties if we don't act quickly on climate change. The question is whether people say, well, it doesn't really matter whether they believe it or not, they're finally doing something and that's great, and give them a tick, or whether people say they don't really believe it, they're being forced to do it. I'm concerned that there's not a genuineness behind it, and I'll mark them down. And it's hard to know at this point how that'll play. But I think the coalition's very conscious of the politics of climate change and how potent it's been in the past, and it has the potential, certainly, as Andrew said, I think, to be potent again.
Thanks, Karen. Clearly, climate change is one of those things that we're seeing from Andrew's results coming back up as an issue of concern. So this, Karen, was particularly addressed to you as to your thoughts on the overall perspective of the Australian population regarding the urgency of climate change. And do you think our leaders are addressing it enough?
No, they haven't been for a long time. I mean, as I've just said, there's been more on the Labor and Green side than there has been on the coalition side, but there are plenty in the coalition who've been frustrated at the lack of action on climate change. And I think there's a constituency of coalition voters who are very concerned. I think the concern is broader now. We've just been through, well, certainly, the summer before last, a very hot summer, the terrible fires, again, as it did more than 10 years ago when the coalition ended up being replaced by Labor. There was that confluence of drought and climate change activism that made that issue very potent. And I think we're seeing, because of that change in the United States, that this issue is now very potent politically, potentially again. So the leaders are going to have to do something about it. But I do feel that there's a greater acceptance across the community that we need to do something about climate change. Certainly business has been way ahead of governments in acting on climate change. Insurance companies have been factoring it in actuarially. Banks have been particular about what projects they will and won't fund based on, fossil fuel considerations. So in some ways, governments have been the tardy ones, the politicians have been the tardy ones, and there's been a decision taken over many years to politicize that as an issue, to weaponize it. And I think that governments are going to be able to get away with that a lot less now. I think that there's been a sort of tipping point in the community of attitudes to climate change that make that a lot harder to do. But I mean, they'll still be arguing over how to get there, but I think there's less arguing over the need to do something.
Yeah. And then to you, Andrew, do you see public opinion regarding government and leadership changing significantly into the future by 2022, perhaps?
My expectation is that the patterns that we're seeing, which is a return to normal, and part of the normal is where people are very sceptical and cynical with regard to government, that there is that shift underway. And if, the Parliament, as it is, it reverts to, that combative style, that will just feed that process. Not necessarily the best outcome for Australia, I don't think, because so much energy is wasted on issues that are really of no national significance.
So both of you have sort of talked to, aside from 2020, as you both mentioned, there has been a time when there has been a significant change in that trust in government level, particularly 2009, 2010. The question really relates more to what do you think influenced that, and what does it say about leadership more broadly? And I know Karen sort of referenced what happened in 2009 in your comments, but can you make a thought about what you saw then and how that has influenced, or what that tells us about leadership or Australians' views about leadership?
Andrew?
Okay, so like Karen covered that, I think, really interestingly, and drew on the findings of Rebecca Huntley. I think that in 2008, there have been periods in Australian history where there was a great impetus for reform. There was a recognition that the country was falling behind, but there had been challenges that had not been met. And I think, the election of the Whitlam government and the slogan, "It's time," in 1972 was such an occasion. There have been other times as well. I think prior to the election of Labor in 2009 and the Rudd government, again, there'd been like this huge expectations that, the government was going to change and address issues that needed addressing. I don't think that was the situation that we found ourselves in 2019, 2020. I don't think that, for example, and Karen, I'd be interested in your views on this, I don't think that the election of Scott Morrison was on the basis that people had great confidence and expectation, that he was going to address substantial issues, that it was probably more an issue of the campaign that Labor ran. And not really seizing the opportunities. So the increase in trust occurred, let's say, in 1972. It might have occurred in 1983 with the Hawke government. It didn't occur in a similar way in 2020. It was rather the response to crisis and effective management. And the risk there is that as the crisis subsides, what are you left with? As the waters recede, what are you left with? And you may be left with a government that does not have those policies that it was elected to take the country forward. Karen, what do you think?
Yeah, well, one of the things to note there, I guess, is that the expectations thing and the big change thing comes when there's a change of government. So what we saw in 2019 was the re-election of an existing government. And, we go to that old saying that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. And it's when a government has run its course in the sense of it's been there for a while, or it's done something that's really angered the community, that's when or there's just a sense of malaise or drift, that's when you'll see the potential for change. But they have to be able to look to the other person, the leader on the other side and the other side itself, and say, yes, I'm prepared to cop that person isn't going to offend me, and those policies aren't going to offend me. So there's always an issue when there is a sense of a malaise or a criticism of an incumbent government, and the opposition seizes on that and pitches grandly, as Kevin Rudd did, for example. There's always the issue of expectations management, and that's where we've seen new leaders come undone a bit. I think public attitudes to leadership change have become quite cynical, because we've seen that rotation of leaders over a decade without recourse to the voter, and people got a bit annoyed at that. But having said that, if the person that that is replaced in between elections was really on the nose with the electorate. They seem less concerned about the arbitrary nature of people being replaced. So the electorate is a little bit fickle in that respect, but I do think there's the issue of expectations management when an opposition is campaigning for to try and win government, and that the issue of meeting those expectations and the sort of dramatic shifts that we've seen in terms of trust usually follow the change of government.
So Karen, can I just pick up on that with this question? The forgotten people, Howard's battlers, and now the quiet Australians. Do you find similarities between these constituencies over time, and what impact do you think they'll have on the next election?
Yes, I think the ideas of those labels taps into people's sense that some people sense that they're not doing as well as other people. And that's it's a relative thing. You might be doing okay arbitrarily according to some measure of income or something else, but you might still feel that other people are doing better, or you're not doing as well as you could, or it's not fair somehow. And so those labels tap into the sense that there are people striving and still not getting ahead, or not getting as far ahead as other people, and that that's somehow unfair, and that one side of politics is representing them better than the other side. So it enables a party to tap into the sort of emotion and the looking at your neighbours and saying, well, it's they've got more than I've got, that's not fair. And that might be because they get certain amounts of government handouts that you don't get. It might be because they earn better than you, they've got better access to, I don't know, housing services, anything. It's a kind of catch-all that can fit in a number of circumstances, and it's played out. The Howard's battlers, for example, that was coined when the coalition very much targeted voters in seats like the seats in Western Sydney, which had traditionally been Labor electorates, or Labor-leaning electorates. But the coalition had managed to tap into the sentiment that we are actually the ones who are offering you more. We can meet your ambitions. We can give you opportunities. You don't have to always vote Labor. You can vote for the coalition and have a better life. And so, the idea of a better life was very appealing, and those people stuck with John Howard for a long time.
And one idea sparked by this question is that oscillation between trust and cynicism on the one hand, heavy government involvement, government withdrawing, the oscillation between an activist government, social engineering, if you would, as distinct from like Menzies' promise for the forgotten people that, now will be their time, and that they will have the freedom, there will be freedom for private enterprise, following the period of regulation in the 1940s, that government will withdraw. Now, I don't see this country heading in that direction in the years ahead, because the scale of the problems are such that, people look to government to deal with this, because individuals and private enterprise can't. The point Karen made about the response of big business to some of these challenges and recognition of these challenges. On one of the discussion forum, the point was made that this criticism of expertise, the people who know, the scientists, which was very powerful, let's say, in the previous years prior to the pandemic, it's less effective now, because how do we have some hope of getting out of this problem? And it's by actually listening to the medical experts and the scientific experts.
Yeah.
And I think that discourse, that narrative is not going to go away.
So thank you, Andrew. I think sort of almost extending this beyond is, do you see the changes in the ageing population and the increasing diversity demographics as having any impact on political party support?
From my point of view, I think it's going to depend very much on policy responses. And I would say we will also see in next week's budget a number of measures focused on the ageing. As a result of that Royal Commission, so many terrible things have been exposed about the system's failures, that they will need to be addressed. And I think if the government doesn't do something to be seen to address those in a financial way at the very least, it'll be marked down for that. So I would expect that it would be very conscious of doing something for the aged, and then the opposition will have to figure out what it can offer that will might be seen by some in the ageing community as a better alternative. But I do think people are very concerned. I mean, you know, in the old days, you might have said, you know, older Australians were more likely to vote Conservative and younger Australians were more likely to vote Progressive. I think that's it's a bit less clear these days. And I think certainly in the case of the aged, that people will be looking very much to policy responses. And it goes back to that point that Andrew made, the Professor Markus made about action and being seen to actually do something and not just talk. I think there's a really strong sentiment that goes right across all the demographics that people are tired of platitudes and just talk, and they really want to see something concrete change.
Like the emphasis in this question on increasing diversity in demographics is an interesting one that we haven't really touched on. Like one of the interesting findings of the 2020 Scanlon surveys was the high level of continuing endorsement of multiculturalism, acceptance of diversity, that we didn't actually, with a whole range of questions due to immigration and diversity, see a downturn in negative attitudes. And obviously at the present time, there is no immigration. So it's more an issue of how can we actually restart immigration being the focus rather than the problem of immigration. The problem of lack of immigration is shown in, say, rural areas where farmers are unable to get the labour that they need. And so I think it does provide an opportunity for having a positive discussion about the value of immigration and having wider recognition of that.
Yeah, and just to clarify something I said in my presentation, which might have been a bit unclear when I talked about referencing attitudes to immigration in relation to the India ban. Obviously, the ban on people coming from India about Australians, but the breakdown Andrew, in your figures was interesting in terms of party by party. Because what you could clearly see was that certain people who voted in particular ways had strong views one way or the other on immigration. And I think a number of those same people might view this, even though we're talking about Australians, as an immigration issue because they might have particular views about people from certain countries. And so, you know, you can see when you see those figures broken down, you can see why parties might target particular issues, messages, policies, rhetoric to certain parts of the community in seats where they might want to win, and that's perhaps in a, you know, you might suggest that's in a kind of a negative way, and equally you could do that in a positive way with positive attitudes, overall positive attitudes, but also, you know, in specific areas, positive attitudes, measures that would address or reinforce those attitudes in areas where you want to gain support.
Thank you, Karen. So just as one final question for our session today, do you think, how do you think government impacts social cohesion, or do you think it simply reflects what's going on in society at the moment? So Karen first, perhaps.
I think government does have an impact on social cohesion. I think it both reflects social cohesion, or the lack of it sometimes, and it both reflects it and has an impact on it. Certainly government, in the decisions that it makes, in the messages that it sends, has a dramatic impact potentially on social cohesion. You know, we've seen that in places around the world where governments and leaders work to bring communities together, that they have a big impact. And when they are seen to turn on sections of the community, they equally have a big impact. But they also reflect what's going on in the community. And governments pick up on messages from the community and seek to reflect them back or represent those messages. So I think they do both things. I would prefer that they do both things for good rather than to be divisive. But and I think taking steps and making statements in the interests of unity as opposed to in the interests of political advantage is always better.
And the point I would make, it's not one or the other, it's both. Karen, I think you're saying that, yes?
Yes, yeah.
But governments can act by their messaging and the way that they deal with issues and the way they lead or don't lead do have a significant impact on social cohesion. And we can actually see that in our surveys. So that, for example, you can look at states with similar demographic profiles, or in many respects similar, and quite different attitudes. Like in some states, the Muslim issue, however it's framed, has more salience than other states. Attitudes to multiculturalism and acceptance of government promotion of multicultural issues, again, plays out differently. So it's obviously a complex equation, but governments do have a very significant role in providing leadership.
And COVID-19 is a perfect example, because the federal government has done really well and the state and territory governments have also done really well. And we haven't seen fracturing in the community as we might have seen in other places. There's a bit of barneying about the vaccination rollout at the moment, but on the whole, as a country and as a community, we've pulled together under the leadership of a Prime Minister and state and territory leaders together to take difficult steps, to do hard things in order to address the problem on behalf of the community. And I think we've seen a lot more individualism in some other countries and an unwillingness to take those community steps. And that in the end is driven not only from the community, but from the top.
Andrew and Karen, thank you so much for answering these questions from our audience today and for sharing your insights and expertise with us. I think you've set us up very well for thinking about the forthcoming budget, but also leadership in general and where we might see things lead up to the election and well beyond into 2022. So a very big thank you to you, Andrew, and to Karen. Your contributions have really made today's session absolutely invaluable. And also to our audience from across the country for joining us for today's webinar. While the Mapping Social Cohesion research series is now in its 13th year, this has been the first year that we've run a series of digital events to launch and explore the report's findings. To help us inform future events, we greatly appreciate your feedback on our follow-up session this afternoon via a short anonymous survey which will appear in your browser once you exit this webinar. And a link to the survey will also be sent to you in an email very shortly. So please let us know your thoughts. We'd really appreciate it. Be sure to use hashtag Social Cohesion Report if you're continuing the conversation online following today's session. And please feel free to visit the scanloninstitute.org.au to sign up to receive updates or upcoming events, or to access the 2020 Mapping Social Cohesion Report, or to read any of our most recent publications. So thank you all again for joining us and have a great afternoon. We hope to see you soon. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.